She walked through that gate with $11 a coil of rope and nothing left to lose. The horse inside that stall had already broken 2 men, shattered one man's ribs, ended another man's ability to walk straight. 3 years, 11 breakers, 0 survivors. She went in anyway, not because she was fearless, because she was desperate. And sometimes desperate is the only kind of brave that's real. What happened inside that barn over the next 57 days would change everything. The horse, the man who owned him, and the woman who refused to leave until she had jumped the wall that had defeated them all. If this story moves you, subscribe right now and follow every chapter to the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1887 arrived in Ashbourne County the way bad news always does, without warning and without mercy. By the time Evelyn Harper was 24 years old, she had buried her father, lost the family lease, and spent 14 months breaking horses for men who never once learned her name. She had calluses on her palms thick as boot leather, and a jaw set so hard that people in town sometimes mistook it for arrogance. It wasn't arrogance. It was the particular expression of a woman who had decided somewhere between grief and desperation that she was not going to break before the world did. She arrived at the gates of Ashbourne Range on a Tuesday morning in July, when the heat was already sitting on the land like something alive and malicious. The dust came up off the road in thin red spirals. Her boots were worn through at the left heel. She had $11.40 to her name, a coil of hemp rope over one shoulder, and a letter of introduction from Marcus Doyle, the ranch foreman she'd broken 3 horses for the previous autumn, tucked into her coat pocket. The gate hand looked at her the way men in this county always looked at women who arrived alone and on foot. "Business," he said. He didn't look up from the post he was leaning against. "Horsework," Evelyn said. He looked up then. "You the breaker Doyle sent word about?" "I am." He studied her for a long moment, her frame, her hands, the rope. His expression moved through several things before settling on something that wasn't quite doubt and wasn't quite respect. He stepped aside. "Follow the fence line to the second barn," he said. "And don't go near the black stall at the end. That's not a friendly suggestion, miss. That's the kind of thing they'd put on your gravestone if you didn't listen." Evelyn said nothing. She walked through the gate. Marcus Doyle met her at the barn door with a handshake that told her he was genuinely relieved she'd come. He was a thick-shouldered man in his 40s, with a sun-cracked face and the eyes of someone who had seen too many things go wrong in a row. He gripped her hand once firm and released it. "Evelyn. Good. You made it. Said I would. Didn't doubt you." He glanced past her toward the far end of the barn, and something shifted in his expression. "Come inside. We need to talk before you see him." She followed him into the shade of the barn. It smelled of hay and horses and something else underneath something she placed after a moment as old blood and fear. The horses in the near stalls were calm. Quarter horses, a roan mare, 2 bays. They watched her with the casual interest of animals who had no reason to be afraid. The sound from the far end was different entirely. It started as she stepped through the door, a low rhythmic impact like a hammer striking the same nail over and over. Then louder. Then the whole barn seemed to shudder once, and a sound came out of that black stall at the end that was less like a horse and more like something trying to escape from inside the earth. "That's ruin," Marcus said. "That his name or his reputation? Both." Marcus sat down on a feed crate and pressed his hands together. "He's a 16-3 Irish draft cross. Came to us 3 years ago from a breeder in Kentucky who swore blind he'd been handled socialized and worked on a lunge line since birth." He paused. "That man lied." "What happened to the breakers who tried him?" Marcus held up 2 fingers. "Benny Calhoun broke his collarbone, and 3 ribs spent 6 weeks in bed. Jake Merritt." He stopped. "Jake's not breaking horses anymore." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Dead. No, but he don't walk the same." Marcus looked at her directly. "I brought you here because Doyle's word is good, and you're the best I've seen without a formal yard behind you. But I need you to understand what you're walking into. This isn't a green horse. This isn't a spooked horse. This is an animal that has decided somewhere inside himself that human beings are the enemy, every single one of them. What does the owner want done with him? Marcus hesitated. That's the other part. She met William Ashford an hour later. He came out of the main house at 10:30, unhurried, dressed in riding clothes that cost more than Evelyn had earned in the last 4 months. He was tall, not dramatically so, but the kind of tall that filled a doorway and made a room adjust around him. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples. He was somewhere between 34 and 40, and the gap between those two numbers was filled entirely by whatever had happened to the left side of his face, where a scar ran thin and white from his cheekbone to the corner of his jaw. He looked at Evelyn the way a man looks at something placed in front of him that he didn't order and isn't sure what to do with. "You're the breaker," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the verbal equivalent of making a note. "Evelyn Harper," she said. She didn't extend her hand. In her experience, men like this didn't shake hands with women like her, and she wasn't interested in offering something that would only be declined. "Marcus tells me you have a horse. I have a problem," William said. "The horse is the shape the problem takes." He walked past her toward the barn, and she followed because that was apparently how this was going to go. "3 years," he said as they walked. "I have spent 3 years and a significant amount of money attempting to make that animal functional. Every breaker who has come through these gates has either failed or been injured. The horse has not improved. In fact," he paused outside the barn door, "I believe he has gotten worse. What do you want me to do? I want you to break him." He turned and looked at her. "Completely. I want him rideable, controllable, and safe for the paddock. If you can do that, I'll pay $50 and a month's lodging on the property." $50. Evelyn kept her face still. $50 was 3 months of regular work. $50 was the difference between where she was standing right now and somewhere she could breathe for a minute. "And if I can't," she said. William's expression didn't change. "Then you'll be added to a list of people who couldn't, and Marcus will show you out." He looked at her once more, a long, assessing look that seemed to expect something and find nothing in particular. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Harper. I don't expect you to succeed. I expect you to try, get hurt, and leave. That has been the pattern. Then why hire me? Because doing nothing costs me more." He pushed the barn door open. "Come, you should see what you're agreeing to." The stall at the end of the barn was reinforced. That was the first thing she noticed. The wood on the door was doubled iron banded at 3 heights, and the hinges were bolted through the frame with hardware she'd never seen outside a jail. The floor in front of it was gouged and scarred where previous occupants of the space had been thrown against it. Ruin heard them coming. The sound changed, the rhythmic hammering stopped, and in its place came something worse. Silence, and then a single slow impact that moved through the floor and into Evelyn's boots like a warning. William stopped 10 feet from the stall door. "Don't go closer than this," he said. "I need to see him." "You can see him from here." "I need to see his eyes." William looked at her for a moment, then stepped aside. She walked to within 4 feet of the door. There was a gap between 2 boards, a horizontal strip of shadow and light, and she leaned in and looked through it. Ruin looked back at her. He was black. Not the warm black of a well-groomed horse, but the flat, absolute black of something that had absorbed every piece of light ever thrown at it and given none of it back. His head was massive, his neck thick as a tree trunk, and he stood in the center of the stall with all 4 feet planted like he owned every inch of the ground and was daring someone to suggest otherwise. His eyes were the thing. She'd seen fear in horses before. She'd seen aggression, confusion, pain, green-broke wildness. She'd seen horses that had been hurt by men, and horses that had been spoiled by men, and horses that simply had more spirit than the people around them knew what to do with. Ruin's eyes were none of those things. Ruin's eyes were a decision, He had looked at every human being who had come to this stall and made a decision about them, and the decision was always the same. And now he was looking at her, and the decision was already forming, and she could see it happening the way you can see a storm organizing itself on the horizon before anyone else thinks to look up. She held his gaze. She did not step back. She was aware of William behind her, and Marcus at the barn entrance, and the heat pressing down through the roof, and her own heartbeat doing something complicated in her chest. But she held the horse's gaze and breathed slowly and waited. Ruin blinked. Once. Just once. And then he turned his head away, and the decision in his eyes was the same as it had always been. But something else was there, too. Something she couldn't name yet. She stepped back from the door. "I'll do it," she said. William gave her the tack room at the end of the main barn for sleeping, a narrow space, with a cot, a lamp, and a hook on the wall. It was clean, which she hadn't expected. She set her bag down and sat on the edge of the cot for a moment, and let herself feel all the things she hadn't let herself feel in front of him. She was afraid. That was reasonable. Benny Calhoun had broken 3 ribs. Jake Merritt didn't walk right anymore. She was 5'4" and 130 pounds, and the horse in that stall was built like a force of nature, and had been making that very clear to everyone who'd come near him for 3 years. But she had been afraid before. Fear was familiar. Fear was actually useful if you knew what to do with it. She unpacked her rope, her leather gloves, the soft cotton lead line she used for first contact with difficult horses. She laid them on the cot and looked at them and thought about what she knew. She knew this broken horses broke because something had been done to them. Not always obviously. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it was something small repeated over time. A wrong hand, a harsh bit, a lesson taught with pain instead of patience. And sometimes an animal decided from that small repeated thing that the entire world was a threat. The question was never whether you could overpower that decision. You couldn't. Not with an animal this size, this committed, this intelligent. The question was whether you could reach behind the decision to whatever was underneath it. She wasn't sure she could. She was sure she was going to try. She started the next morning before anyone else was up. The heat was already beginning at 6 o'clock, the particular summer heat of this part of the territory that didn't build so much as arrive all at once like a door thrown open into a furnace. She was dressed and at the barn by 5:45, and she spent the first 15 minutes just standing outside the stall, quiet, doing nothing. Ruin heard her immediately. The quality of silence from inside the stall changed. It became watchful, loaded, a silence that had weight. She heard his breathing shift. She heard one slow footfall as he adjusted his position. She stood there and let him hear her breathe. This was the part that other breakers always skipped. She'd watched enough of them work to know that. They came in with a plan. Ropes, techniques, methods. The particular approach their teacher had taught them, and their success had confirmed. They came in ready to act. She came in ready to wait. After 30 minutes, she unlatched the outer bolt on the stall door. Not the door itself, just the bolt, slowly, so that the sound was deliberate and predictable and not startling. Then she relatched it and walked away. She came back an hour later, unlatched the bolt, relatched it, walked away. She did this 5 times over the course of the morning. By the 5th time, Ruin had stopped moving to the far wall when he heard the bolt. Marcus found her at the water trough around noon, washing her hands. "What are you doing out here?" he said. "I expected to hear something by now." "You heard nothing because nothing happened," she said. "That's the point." He frowned. "The other breakers went in on day 1. "I know." She dried her hands on her trousers. "How'd that go for them?" He was quiet for a moment. "You've got a theory." "I've got experience," she said. "He's not wild. Wild horses are scared and reactive, and they're trying to get away from you. He's not trying to get away from anything." She looked toward the barn. "He's waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For someone to do what everyone else has done. Come in hard, come in fast, try to establish authority before you've established anything else." She shook her head. "He knows that pattern. He's beaten that pattern 11 times now. You do that pattern with him and you're just confirming what he already believes. Marcus studied her. And what does he believe? That we're all the same, she said. Every last one of us. She picked up her rope and walked back toward the barn. On the afternoon of the second day, she opened the stall door. She didn't go in. She stood in the doorway, the door opened the gap. A rectangle of light at her back, her hands loose at her sides, and she waited. Ruin went to the far wall immediately. Both of them knew he was going to do that. She let him. She stood in the doorway and breathed and looked slightly to the left of him. Not at him directly, the way you look at something, you're not threatening. He stood at the far wall for 11 minutes. She counted. Then he took one step toward the center of the stall. She did not move. He took another step. She exhaled slow and long, the way a horse exhales when it relaxes, and she actually heard, something shift in his breathing. Not much. A fraction of a thing. She stepped back and pulled the door closed. Not slammed. Not latched fast in fear. She pulled it closed, the way you close a door on a room where someone is sleeping carefully, with respect for what was inside. William watched this from the rail of the paddock. He didn't announce himself. He came out of the main house at some point during the afternoon, and he stood at the fence that bordered the space between the paddock and the barn, and he watched. She knew he was there. She'd heard his boots on the gravel. She didn't look at him. When she came out of the barn for the final time that evening, he was still at the fence. "Nothing happened," he said. "Something happened," she said. "You just didn't see it. I've been watching for 2 hours." With respect, Mr. Ashford, watching isn't the same as seeing. He was quiet. She wasn't sure if he was going to be angry. Men who were used to being agreed with didn't always handle the other thing gracefully. "Explain it to me," he said finally. She stopped and looked at him. It was the first time she'd really looked at him since the initial meeting, really looked, not the quick professional assessment she'd done in the first 30 seconds. The scar on his face caught the evening light. His expression was not angry. It was something more complicated than that. "He went to the back of the stall when I opened the door," she said. "That's retreat. 3 days ago he'd have come at the door. Today he retreated." William frowned. "That sounds like fear." "It is fear." She held his gaze. "Fear is what I'm looking for. Fear means he's still calculating. Fear means he's not just running on rage anymore. Something I've done these past 2 days has given him something to think about." "And what have you done?" "Nothing," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through it, the logic of it, and the part of him that resisted the logic, because it ran against everything he assumed about how things got done in the world. "That seems like a very slow way to earn $50, he said. "Faster than the alternative," she said. "Benny Calhoun's way was faster. Look how that worked out." She didn't wait for a response. She walked back toward the tack room. She heard after a moment the sound of his boots moving on the gravel. Not after her. Just moving restless like a man who'd been given something to think about and wasn't sure he wanted it. On the morning of the 4th day she went in. She brought nothing with her, no rope, no lead, no equipment of any kind. Just herself and her boots and her hands open at her sides. She'd left the rope on the cot deliberately so that she'd have to make the decision every single morning to go in without it, and every single morning that decision would be fresh and chosen and not just habit. She unlatched the door. She pushed it open. She walked in. Ruin came off the far wall like a freight train. She heard Marcus shout something from the barn entrance, her name probably, or a warning that was already too late, and then Ruin was filling every inch of available space in front of her. 1,600 pounds of organized fury, his head low and his teeth exposed, and his eyes showing white at the edges, and she did the one thing that every breaker in that barn had failed to do. She stood still, not frozen, not paralyzed. Still, her feet planted, her hands at her sides, her chin level. Still. He stopped. Not immediately. He pulled up hard 3 feet from her, his hooves throwing up the dirt of the stall floor, his breath hitting her face in a wave of hot rage, and something underneath it that wasn't rage at all. He stopped, and he was close enough that she could see the individual flecks of color in his black coat, close enough that his exhale moved her hair. Neither of them moved. She breathed. He breathed. "All right," she said quietly, the way you'd speak to someone you'd been expecting. "There you are." His ears moved. Just the ears, a fractional rotation, a piece of attention that hadn't been given to anyone in 3 years. She breathed again. "I know," she said. "I know what they did. Not the specific thing, maybe, but the shape of it. The kind of thing that makes you decide people aren't worth trusting." She kept her voice low and even. "I'm not here to argue with that decision. You've had that decision confirmed 11 times. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong." He was still watching her. His feet hadn't moved. "I'm just going to stand here," she said. "That's all. You can do whatever you want about that." She stood there for another 40 minutes. He didn't move toward her again. But he didn't move away either. When she finally backed toward the door, slowly facing him, never turning her back, his eyes followed her all the way to the frame. She stepped out. She latched the door. She put her back against the barn wall and pressed her hands flat against the wood and let her legs shake for exactly as long as they needed to. "You're insane," Marcus said. He'd appeared at her shoulder. His face was the color of old chalk. "You walked in there without a rope, without anything." "I know." "If he'd hit you." "He didn't." "Evelyn." "Marcus." She looked at him. "He stopped. You saw him stop." "I saw him nearly kill you." "No," she said. "You saw him decide not to." She pushed off the wall and picked up her gloves from where she'd left them hanging. "That's not the same thing. That's actually the opposite thing." Marcus stared at her. "There's a difference between brave and reckless." "There's a difference between reckless and calculated," she said. "I calculated. I was scared, but I went in anyway because I needed him to see that I would." She tucked the gloves into her back pocket. "The fear is fine, Marcus. The fear is honest. Horses know honest." She walked back toward the tack room. Behind her, she heard Marcus say very quietly to no one in particular, "Lord above." William was in the barn. She didn't know when he'd come in or how long he'd been there. But when she came through the side door, he was standing near the middle of the space, halfway between the near stalls and the far end. And he was looking at Ruin's door with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She stopped. He looked at her. "How long?" he said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "However long it takes. Could be 2 more weeks. Could be a month. I meant..." He paused. "How long have you been doing this breaking horses?" "Since I was 16, she said. "My father kept a yard." "And the horse on the far wall?" He nodded toward Ruin's stall. "Have you worked with a horse like that before?" She thought about it, honestly. "Not like him," she said. "Not this far gone. But the pattern underneath is the same." William was quiet. He had his arms crossed, not aggressively, more like he was holding something in. He kept looking at the stall. "I tried to ride him," he said, 2 years ago, before the others." She waited. "He threw me in 6 seconds. I know because Marcus counted." The corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. 6 seconds. Then he turned and came back for me, which horses generally don't do. I had to be pulled out of the paddock." He touched the scar at the edge of his jaw, a quick unconscious gesture there and gone. "This was from the fence, not the horse, in case you were wondering." "I wasn't," she said. Then, after a beat, "Why did you keep him?" He turned and looked at her directly. For a moment he didn't answer, and she thought he wasn't going to. "Because getting rid of him felt like giving him the last word," he said. "And I didn't want him to have it." Evelyn looked at the man for a moment, the set of his jaw, the careful stillness he carried like a piece of expensive equipment he was afraid to set down. "You and that horse have more in common than you think," she said. She expected him to bristle. Instead, something moved across his face that was too fast to name, and he looked away. "Get some rest," he said. "You'll need it tomorrow." She walked past him toward the tack room. But she heard him, just before she turned the corner, a sound that wasn't words, just a long, slow exhale, the kind a man makes when he's been holding his breath for a long time and has finally let himself stop. She did not look back. But she heard it. And she thought, there it is. That's the thing underneath the decision. In both of them. She was up before dawn on the 5th day. Not because she'd slept well. She hadn't. She'd lain on the narrow cot in the tack room listening to Ruin shift his weight in the stall at the far end of the barn, that slow, deliberate sound, moving through the floorboards and into her spine. And she'd spent the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning going over every decision she'd made, and every decision she still had to make. By the time the first gray light came under the door, she'd already decided what the 5th day needed to look like. She needed to touch him. Not with a rope. Not with any equipment. Just her hand flat and open, no trick behind it. She needed to close the distance that the first 4 days had opened up into something workable, and she needed to do it before he renegotiated his position on her, because horses, especially horses like Ruin, didn't hold their assessment static for long. Every day she delayed was a day the small amount of ground she'd gained had a chance to erode. She was pulling on her boots when she heard the sound. It came from outside the tack room, boot steps on the barn floor, slow and deliberate, moving toward the far end. She went still and listened. Not Marcus. Marcus walked with a slight drag on his left foot, a leftover from an old brake that hadn't set quite right. These steps were even. Measured. The steps of a man who was used to moving through spaces that belonged to him. William. She finished pulling on her boot and stood up. When she came out into the barn, he was standing in front of Ruin's stall, in the gray pre-dawn dark, his back to her, both hands in his coat pockets. He hadn't lit a lamp. He was just standing there in the almost dark, looking at the closed door. She stopped. He heard her anyway. "I didn't wake you," he said without turning. "I was already up." "Good." He still didn't turn. "I come here sometimes. In the early hours. Marcus thinks I don't, but Marcus goes to bed at 9, so." She walked toward him slowly and came to stand a few feet to his left. They both looked at the stall door. From inside, Ruin had gone very still, that watchful silence she was starting to be able to read like a language. "What do you do when you come here?" she said. "Nothing in particular." A pause. "Look at him. Think about what I'm going to do about him. Think about what it means that I haven't figured it out yet." He exhaled. "Mostly just stand here feeling like an idiot." She glanced at him. In the dim light, his profile was sharp, the jaw, the scar, the set of his mouth that could have been arrogance, and was probably something else entirely. "You're not an idiot," she said. "You're a man who bought a horse he didn't understand, and now he's too invested to let it go." He turned and looked at her then. "That's essentially the same thing." "It's really not." She looked back at the stall. "Idiots don't lose sleep over their mistakes. You're losing sleep. That means you still care whether you get it right." He was quiet for a moment. "And do you lose sleep?" "Every night," she said. "Since I walked through your gate." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. "Today I'm going to touch him," she said. The almost laugh stopped. "Touch him." "My hand, his neck, if he allows it." "And if he doesn't allow it?" "Then I'll have learned something about what today's version of him can handle, and I'll adjust." She looked at William. "I'd prefer if you weren't watching." He raised an eyebrow. "It's my horse." "It's your horse," she agreed. "And your presence changes the situation. He knows you. He has an established position on you. If you're in the barn while I'm working on shifting that position, your presence is a variable I can't control." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching, and she could see the calculations moving behind his eyes, the part of him that wanted to push back against being excluded from anything that happened on his own land. and the part of him that was listening to her actually listening, and finding that what she said made enough sense to be inconvenient. "Fine," he said. "I'll be in the house." He turned to go, then stopped. "Miss Harper." "Yes." "Be careful." He said it without looking at her, and there was something in the way he said it that was not an order, and not quite a request. Something with more weight than either of those things, and she wasn't entirely sure he'd meant to say it. "Always," she said. He walked out of the barn. She stood in the silence he left behind and breathed for a moment. Then she turned to face the stall. "All right," she said quietly. "It's just us." From inside, Ruin shifted his weight once and then was still. She unlatched the door and went in. He came at her faster than the day before. Or maybe it only felt that way because the light was different, the barn darker, and his black coat absorbed what little there was so that he was more movement than shape. She stood her ground, and he pulled up again closer this time, and she felt the air move against her face from the velocity of him stopping. His breath hit her in waves. She didn't speak this time. She just breathed slow and deliberate, and kept her hands open and her eyes soft, not challenging, and waited for his breathing to find a rhythm that wasn't pure adrenaline. It took 7 minutes. She'd learned to count these things not by looking at anything external, but by her own heartbeat, which had gotten very good at estimating time under pressure. 7 minutes of them breathing together in the dim stall, and then slowly, inch by inch, she raised her right hand. Not toward him, not reaching for him. She raised it the way you'd raise your hand if someone across a room had asked if you were okay, just enough, just there, visible and open, and not demanding anything. Ruin watched the hand. His ears rotated forward. She took one step. He stamped one foot hard, and she felt it through her boots, and she stopped. Waited. His ears didn't go back. His head didn't drop into that low threat posture she'd seen on the first day. He stamped once, and then held his ground and watched the hand. She took another step. And then another. And then her hand was 6 inches from his nose, and she wasn't breathing anymore. She'd forgotten to breathe, and she forced herself to exhale slow, right into that space between them, and Ruin's nostrils flared, and he took in everything that exhale carried, and he did something she had not expected. He leaned forward. Not much. A fraction of an inch, a fraction of a decision. But forward. Her hand made contact. The flat of her palm against the side of his jaw just for a second, soft as a thought. He flinched. His whole body went rigid, and his weight shifted back. But he did not bolt, did not strike, did not turn the day into something she'd have to recover from. He went rigid, and she kept her hand there steady, not pressing. And after 3 seconds, the rigidity eased. Not gone. Not trust. Just eased. She stepped back. She withdrew her hand. She breathed. "Good," she said. Barely a sound. "Good." She backed to the door and let herself out. In the barn corridor, she leaned against the wall and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and waited for the shaking to pass, and while she was doing that, she realized she was grinning. Not a polite smile. A grin wide and private, and slightly ridiculous, the kind she hadn't worn in long enough that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. She was still grinning when Marcus appeared at the barn door. He looked at her face, then at the closed stall door, then back at her face. "You touched him," he said. "I did." He took his hat off and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he said softly. "You actually touched him." "One time," she said, "with one hand, for about 3 seconds." She stood up straight. "But yes." Marcus looked at her with something that took him a moment to settle on, and when he did settle on it, it looked like wonder. "The others," he said. "Benny and Jake and the 4 before them, none of them." "I know." She picked up her gloves from the post where she'd left them. "I know they didn't." "How?" Marcus said. "How did you know what to do?" She thought about it. She owed him an honest answer. "I didn't entirely," she said. "I knew what not to do. I knew that everything they tried had made it worse, so I started from the opposite end and worked toward the middle. She looked at the stall, and I knew what that horse looked like, in his eyes. I've seen that look before. She paused. On people mostly, not horses. Marcus was quiet for a moment. On yourself? He asked. She didn't answer that, but she didn't deny it either. She walked out into the rising heat of the morning, and behind her, Marcus said nothing, and Ruin was quiet, and the day began. She went back in the afternoon, and again in the evening. By the end of the 5th day, she'd touched him 4 times. The last time, she kept her hand on his jaw for nearly a full minute, and he didn't flinch at all. She reported this to no one because there was no one to report it to who would understand what it actually meant, except possibly William, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that conversation yet. The 6th day broke mean. The heat arrived early, and without apology by 7 in the morning, it was pressing down on the ranch with the full weight of a July that had apparently decided it had something to prove. The horses in the near stalls were restless, their skin twitching, their movements short and irritated. Heat made horses edgy, especially the sensitive ones. And Ruin, whatever else he was without question the most sensitive horse she had ever been in a stall with. She felt it when she unlocked the barn door. A quality of tension that was different from yesterday's thicker charged, like the air before lightning, even when the sky is clear. She went in anyway. He didn't charge her. That was something. He went to the far wall, which was his way of saying, I see you. I haven't decided yet. And she stood in the open doorway and let him look at her and ran her thumb along the edge of her belt, the way she did when she was thinking. You're having a bad day, she said. I can tell. He stamped. That's fair, she said. I've had a few of those myself. She moved into the stall, not directly toward him, angling slightly left, the way you'd move to give someone space in a narrow hallway. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to come a little closer, and you're going to let me, and then I'm going to leave, and we'll call it even. He watched her come. His ears were back, not flat, not the full aggression signal, but back enough to mean he was unhappy. His tail switched once. She stopped 4 feet away. I'm not going to push it today, she said. You're not in the mood, and I'm not stupid. She stood there for a moment, just present, not asking for anything. I know what this heat does to you. I know you can't get comfortable, and that makes everything feel like a threat that probably isn't. She exhaled slowly. I get that. His ears moved. Not forward, but they came off fully back, settled somewhere in the middle. She reached out and barely grazed the side of his neck with 2 fingers. He shuddered. Like a current had passed through him. She withdrew immediately and stepped back. He didn't follow. He stood there and breathed hard and looked at the floor, and she watched his sides move in and out, and gradually the breathing slowed. She left before she'd pushed anything past what today could hold. It was the right call. She was sure of it by the time she got to the water trough and poured a ladle of water over the back of her neck. The right call wasn't always the dramatic one. Sometimes the right call was knowing when to stop. She was thinking about this, about stopping points, and the discipline of knowing them, when William appeared around the corner of the barn. He was carrying 2 tin mugs. She stared at the mugs for a moment because they were so fundamentally out of place in what she'd constructed as her mental picture of William Ashford that her brain took a second to process them. Coffee, he said. He held one out. She took it. Thank you. He leaned against the fence post and drank his and looked at the barn. She drank hers and did the same. The heat sat on them both, and neither of them said anything for a minute. Marcus told me about yesterday, William said. The touching. I asked him not to. He didn't tell me to report. He told me because he was... William paused, choosing the word. Moved. I think that's the word. He looked like a man who'd witnessed something he didn't have a category for. She wrapped her hands around the mug. It was 3 seconds and a flinch, she said. It's not a victory. It's a beginning. How far are you from riding him? Weeks, she said. Maybe more. She looked at him sideways. I know that's not what you want to hear. "I want to hear the truth," he said. "I've had enough of people telling me what they thought I wanted to hear about that horse." He drank his coffee. "The last breaker told me he'd have him saddled in 4 days. He lasted 2 hours in the stall and came out needing 7 stitches in his forearm." "You didn't tell me that before I agreed," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I thought you'd leave," he said. It came out evenly, like a fact, like he was reading something off a page, but under the evenness there was something he was making an effort not to let show, and she heard it anyway. "Would that have been so bad?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Just that." No elaboration. She looked at him. He was looking at the barn, his profile still, his jaw set. He hadn't meant to say that with the weight it carried, she could tell. He'd meant it to come out practical. Another breaker leaving would have been an inconvenience, a logistical problem. But it hadn't come out that way, and they both knew it. She turned back to her coffee and drank without speaking. Sometimes, silence was the kindest thing you could do for a person. The 7th day was the day Marcus brought the news from town. He came back from the feed supply run with a look on his face that she recognized before he'd said a single word, the particular look of a man carrying information he wishes he didn't have. "There's talk," he said when they were alone in the barn. "In town. About you being here." She went still. "What kind of talk?" "The usual kind." He leaned against the stall post and looked at his boots. "You know how it is. A woman working on a ranch, living in the barn, working alone with a man who's got no wife and no—" He stopped. "People make stories out of nothing. You know how they are." She did know. She'd known it before she'd walked through the gate. She'd told herself it didn't matter which was the lie you told yourself when the alternative was letting it stop you. "Does Mr. Ashford know?" she said. "He knows there's talk. I'm not sure he knows the shape it's taking." Marcus looked at her. "I thought you should be prepared." "I'm prepared," she said. "I've been prepared for that particular conversation my whole life." She picked up her lead line. "It doesn't change anything. Evelyn." His voice caught her at the door. She turned. "I want you to know," he said. "For whatever it's worth coming from an old man who doesn't have much standing in this county, I know exactly why you're here and exactly what you've been doing. And it has nothing to do with whatever those people in town are saying." She looked at him for a moment, this worn-down, sun-cracked, genuine man who had gone out of his way to give her a chance when no one else had. "It means a lot," she said, "coming from you." She went into the barn. She was with Ruin when she heard the sound, horses coming up the drive, more than one moving fast. She came out of the stall and moved to the barn door and looked out. 3 riders. Men she didn't recognize. They came into the yard like they owned it, which was a specific kind of arrival that always meant trouble. The one in front was heavy-set, red-faced, wearing the kind of coat that announced wealth before the man inside it had said a word. He swung down from his horse and looked around the yard with a proprietary air that made her stomach tighten. William came out of the main house. "Hollis," he said. His voice was flat in a way she was learning to recognize, not calm, but controlled. The difference was significant. "Ashford." The heavy-set man Hollis extended a hand. William shook it briefly. "Heard you brought in another breaker for that nightmare horse of yours. Thought I'd ride out and see for myself." "You came a long way for something that doesn't concern you," William said. "Friendly interest," Hollis said pleasantly. He had the smile of a man who used pleasantness the way other men used a blade, with precision and at close range. He looked around the yard and his eyes landed on Evelyn in the barn doorway. He looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than he needed to. "That her," he said to William without looking away from her. "That's my horsebreaker," William said. "Hmm?" Hollis smiled wider. "I see she comes with a colorful reputation." Evelyn stepped out of the barn. She wasn't sure why she did it. Some instinct older than strategy that said, "Do not stay in the shadow when someone is making you a subject of discussion." She walked out into the yard and stopped and looked at Hollis directly. "Evelyn Harper," she said. "And you are—" Hollis blinked. He hadn't expected her to speak. They never did. "Preston Hollis," he said, recovering smoothly. "I own the Hollis Acres east of here." "Congratulations," she said. "What brings you out?" He laughed, a short, surprised sound like something had startled it out of him. He looked at William with an expression that said interesting in a way that was also somehow insulting. "I came to make you an offer, actually," Hollis said to William, the smile still in place. "For the horse. Whatever you've spent on him, I'll double it. Cut your losses, be done with it." William's jaw tightened. "The horse isn't for sale. It's a liability. I have heard what it's done to your breakers." Hollis gestured toward Evelyn without looking at her. "And whatever this current arrangement costs you, we both know it's going to end the same way." He lowered his voice slightly, the way men do when they're making a point they want to land. "The animal is broken, William. Some things can't be fixed." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Evelyn looked at William. He was looking at Hollis with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not anger, or not only anger. Something underneath it that was older and rawer than anger. Something that Hollis's last sentence had struck like a match strikes a wall. "Some things can't be fixed. I'll say it plainly," William said. His voice was even. "This is my land, that's my horse, and this is my horse breaker. I don't require your offers, and I don't want your advice." He held Hollis's gaze. "You're welcome to stay for water if your horses need it. Otherwise, we're done here." Hollis's smile stayed on his face the way a flag stays up even after the wind is gone, held in place by structure alone. He looked at Evelyn once more, and the look was quick and dismissive, and said everything about what he thought of her specifically and the situation generally. "Your loss," he said pleasantly. He remounted, and his 2 men with him. "When you're ready to be reasonable, Ashford, you know where to find me." He rode out of the yard without another word. The dust settled. William stood where he was for a moment, and then he turned and looked at Evelyn with an expression that had dropped its careful control for exactly 1 unguarded second. "Are you all right?" he said. She was startled by the question, by the fact that it was directed at her specifically, not a general address to the situation, but to her. "I'm fine," she said. "What he implied isn't new," she said. "And I don't need you to apologize for it." "I wasn't going to apologize. I was going to say it was wrong." He said it simply, like a statement of fact, and that his presence here isn't something I invited or wanted. She looked at him. "You called the horse a liability once yourself," she said. "First day." "I know," he said. "I was wrong about that too." She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything. And in that silence, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but she could feel it, the way you feel when a room changes temperature even before you can name the difference. "I'm going back in," she said. "Ruin doesn't care about Preston Hollis." She went back into the barn, and behind her, she heard William exhale long and slow like a man setting down something heavy. 3 days later, she put a rope on Ruin for the first time. Not a lunge line, not a halter, just a loop loose, barely touching, draped over his neck like a suggestion. She'd brought it in under her arm that morning and left it on the stall post for an hour before she even picked it up so that his eyes had time to get used to it being in the space. When she finally lifted it and moved toward him, he watched it with an intensity that was itself information, not panic, not the wide-eye bolt reaction she'd been prepared for. Wariness. Deep, experienced wariness, which meant someone had done something wrong with a rope in his past, and his memory of it was as clear and specific as a scar. "I know," she said softly. "I know what happened with a rope before. I'm not that." She brought it close. He flinched back once hard, and she stopped and waited. She waited for 4 minutes. Then she moved in again. When the loop settled over his neck, he froze completely. Every muscle locked. His breathing stopped, the whole vast and powerful architecture of him gone rigid. She didn't move. She held the rope loose. No tension, no pull, just presence. and she talked low and continuous, the way you talk to someone who is terrified and needs to hear that the voice in the room is not a threat. "You're okay?" she said. "You're okay? Nothing's pulling, nothing's going to pull. This is just a rope. It doesn't mean what it meant before. I'm deciding what it means now, and what it means now is nothing. It means we're standing here together. That's all." 30 seconds. A minute. His breathing came back. Ragged at first, then slower. She released the rope, slid it off him, stepped back. He stood in the center of the stall, looking at her with something in his eyes that she had never seen in there before. Not trust, not yet. But the question of trust. The open, uncertain, terrifying question of it. She felt her throat tighten. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know, it's a lot to ask." She left him with it. William was waiting in the barn corridor. He'd broken his own rule she'd told him not to watch, and he'd watched anyway, standing far enough back that she hadn't seen him, but close enough that he'd seen everything. She stopped when she saw him. He looked, there was no other word for it, shaken. Not visibly, not in any way that Preston Hollis or a man like him would ever see. But she was learning to read the spaces around William Ashford's control, the places where the careful management of his expression left gaps, and what was in the gaps right now was something raw and real, and not quite put back together. "You heard me talking to him?" she said. "Yes." "That wasn't for an audience. I know." He didn't apologize for being there. "What you said to him?" He stopped. "About the rope. About it not meaning what it meant before." She waited. "Do you believe that?" he said. "That things can stop meaning what they used to mean? That you can just decide what something means and have that decision count?" She looked at him carefully. "I believe you can try," she said. "I believe that trying changes something. Maybe not everything, maybe not all at once." She paused. "Why?" He looked toward the stall where Ruin was quiet now settling. "Because I've been trying to decide what certain things mean for a long time," he said. "And I'm not sure the trying has done what I hoped." She didn't ask what things. She didn't push. She'd learned that you could ask a horse a question and crowd him at the same time, and the crowding would cancel the question. "It took Ruin 10 days to let me touch him," she said. "It's going to take longer than 10 days for the rest of it." He nodded slowly. "And you're patient enough for that." "I don't have a choice," she said. "Neither does he." She walked past him, and he let her go, and she heard behind her the quiet sound of him moving to stand in front of Ruin's stall. Not loud, not dramatic, just a man and a horse in the early evening, and a silence between them that had something new in it. Something that might, if left alone long enough, become something else. On the 12th day, Ruin walked to her. She was standing in the middle of the stall, hands at her sides, and he crossed the space between them on his own terms, 4 slow steps, and put his nose against her shoulder. Not hard, not aggressive, soft, searching. She put her hand on his neck and held it there, and felt him breathe, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something decides to trust you. Not dramatic, not clean, not without everything that came before it, the charges, the flinches, the rigid terror of the rope, the long quiet hours of 2 beings learning to breathe at the same rate. Just 4 steps, and a soft nose on her shoulder. She stood there in the stall in the July heat, with her hand on this impossible horse, and let herself for one private and unmeasured moment feel the full weight of what it had cost to get here. Then she heard a sound from outside the stall that she recognized immediately. Not Marcus. She lifted her head. Ruin lifted his. William was standing outside the door, not pressing his face to the gap in the boards, but standing back far enough to be respectful, close enough that he'd seen it happen. And on his face was something she had no word for. Not the careful blankness of a man managing his expression. Not the proprietary satisfaction of an owner watching an investment perform. Something older than either of those. Something that looked from where she stood like grief. He never did that, William said, quietly. Not to her, really. To the air. In 3 years. He never. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. And ruin stood between them, breathing with no decision left to make. The morning after Ruin walked to her, everything changed. Not in the way she'd expected. Not in the clean, forward-moving way that progress was supposed to work, one day harder than the last, each session building on the previous one, a clear line from where they'd started to where they needed to go. That was the version she'd been telling herself. The version that made sense on paper. What actually happened was that Ruin woke up on the 13th day and decided he hadn't made up his mind yet. She knew it the moment she unlatched the stall door. The quality of his stillness was different. Not the watchful quiet of an animal that was thinking, but the coiled, loaded stillness of something that had spent the night reconsidering. She'd seen it before, in Green Horses, that backward slide after a breakthrough, the way trust moved in a horse. Like water moved downhill, never in a straight line, always finding the low places, always retreating before it could go forward again. She understood it. That didn't make it easier to stand in the doorway and watch him look at her like she was a stranger. "Okay," she said. "We're doing this again." He stamped, hard, once. "That's fine," she said. "I've got time." She did not have time, and they both probably knew it. She had a contract with a deadline attached, $50 on the other side of it, and a horse that had just undone 4 days of careful work in the span of one night. She stood in the doorway for 20 minutes without moving and thought about all of that. And then she set it aside, because thinking about the deadline while standing in front of Ruin was exactly the kind of thing he could feel. Horses read the body like a language, and urgency read loud. She made herself breathe. She made herself wait. On the 14th minute, his ears came forward. On the 20th, she went in. It took the full morning session to get back to where they'd been the day before, the loose rope, the soft contact, the breathing in sync. But they got there. By noon, he had his nose on her shoulder again, and she had her hand on his neck, and she thought, this is what it actually looks like. Not a straight line, a spiral. You come back to the same place, and it looks the same from the outside, but it's different from the inside because you've been here before and you remember the way. She was still thinking about that when she came out of the barn and nearly walked directly into William. He caught her by the shoulder, a reflex quick and immediate, and then released it just as fast, like he'd surprised himself. "Sorry," he said. "My fault," she said. She stepped back. "I wasn't watching." They stood there for a moment, both of them slightly off balance in a way that had nothing to do with the near collision. "How is he?" William said. "Better than this morning. Not as good as yesterday." She looked up at him. "He's going to keep doing this. 2 steps forward, 1 back. You need to know that and not let it change your expectations of the timeline." "My expectations," William said carefully, "have already been revised substantially." He paused. "I watched you this morning. Before you went in. You stood in that doorway for 20 minutes without moving." "I know. Most people would have read that as a setback and reacted to it." "Most people would have been wrong," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" "The patience of it. Not the technique, the patience." She thought about it. "My father," she said finally. "He wasn't a patient man by nature. He was the kind of man who wanted things done, and wanted them done right, and wanted them done now." She paused. "But with horses he was different. He used to say the horse doesn't owe you his trust. You earn it or you don't. And if you're in a hurry about it, you've already failed." "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," she said. She said it flatly, the way you say something that has been processed and put away. She picked up her gloves from the fence post. "I'm going to try a saddle blanket tomorrow. Not a saddle, just the blanket. I want him used to the weight and the smell before I introduce anything else." William nodded. "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. It was such a simple question, and he'd asked it so directly, without any of the performance she'd been bracing for. No attempt to reframe the situation around his own expertise. No suggestion that he knew better, just what do you need? "Nothing right now," she said. "Just keep Hollis off the property." Something moved through William's expression. Has he been back? Not in person, she said. But Marcus says he's been talking, in town. She met William's eyes. About the arrangement here. About me specifically. She kept her voice even. About what it means a woman alone on a man's property with no female supervision and a contract that pays in lodging. The stillness that came over William was a different kind from any she'd seen on him before. It was the stillness of a man making a decision. I see, he said. His voice was very quiet. And what would you like me to do about that? Nothing that would make it worse, she said. Which means no confrontations in town, no dramatic statements, nothing that gives the story more air. She held his gaze. The best thing you can do is let the work speak for itself. When ruin is writable, and he will be writable, there won't be a story left to tell. William looked at her for a long moment. You're more measured about this than I would be. I've had more practice, she said. She walked back to the tack room, and she did not look back, and she did not let herself feel any of the things she was choosing not to feel until she was inside with the door closed behind her. And then she sat on the edge of the cot and pressed her palms to her eyes and gave herself exactly 2 minutes. 2 minutes was enough. It had to be. She got up and went back to work. The saddle blanket went on ruin on the 15th day, and he hated it. Not violently, not the freight train charge of the early days, not the locked and terrified freeze of the rope. This was something more personal. He stood in the center of the stall with the blanket draped loosely over his back, and he pinned his ears and swished his tail with the specific pointed irritation of an animal that was offended rather than afraid. She stood 6 feet away and watched him and bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling, because his irritation was actually the best news she'd had all week. Irritated was not afraid. Irritated was not violent. Irritated was an animal that was in his body enough to have opinions about what was happening to it. I know, she said. It smells wrong, and it feels wrong, and you didn't agree to it. Noted. She stayed where she was. It's staying anyway. He pinned his ears harder. Still staying. He stood there for a full 10 minutes, radiating visible displeasure, and then he sighed an enormous, disgusted, horsey exhale that was so profoundly communicative that she did laugh this time, short and quiet and real. Thank you for that, she said. Very dignified. He looked at her. She could have sworn for one moment that he looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has just said something genuinely funny against their will, that involuntary fractional softening of something that wanted to stay hard. She left the blanket on for an hour. When she took it off, he turned his head and watched her fold it, and she said, "Same time tomorrow." And he looked away with an air of deep resignation that she was choosing to interpret as acceptance. Marcus was at the barn entrance when she came out, leaning on the post with his arms folded and a look on his face like he was watching something he'd decided was either a miracle or a very slow-moving disaster and hadn't made up his mind which. That horse just sighed at you, Marcus said. He did. Like a person. He did. Marcus shook his head slowly. I've been working horses for 30 years, Evelyn. I have never... He stopped. That animal has had 2 grown men and a vet declare him unworkable. Genuinely unworkable, not just difficult. And you just made him sigh at you like a man told to eat his vegetables. She hung the blanket on the post. He's not unworkable. He was misread. There's a difference between being misread and what that horse has been. Yes, she said. And the difference is why everyone else failed. She looked at Marcus. They came in looking for the problem. I came in looking for the horse underneath the problem. Marcus was quiet for a moment. And William, he said, carefully. Is there a horse underneath his problem too? She looked at the older man for a long moment. That's not my business, she said. Isn't it? Marcus said mildly to the fence post. She picked up her rope and walked away before he could see her face. The saddle blanket became routine by the 18th day. Ruin stopped pinning his ears on the 19th. On the 20th day, she introduced the saddle itself, just set it on the fence rail inside the stall within his sight, and did nothing else with it. Just let him look at it, smell it, decide what he thought about it being in the space. He thought about it for 3 days. On the 23rd day, she put it on his back. He exploded. Not at her, the weeks of careful work held that line the deep structural trust she'd been building held. He didn't turn on her. What he did was go straight up all 1,600 pounds of him vertical, and when he came down, he went sideways, and when he went sideways, the saddle went with him and hit the stall wall, and the sound of it was like a gunshot in the enclosed space. She was already against the wall, because she'd read the pre-charge signal. This time, the slight shift in weight, the particular way his head had dropped half an inch, and she'd moved before he'd fully committed to the movement. She put her back against the boards and let him work through it, which was the single hardest thing she'd done in 23 days, because every instinct she had was screaming to intervene, and her brain was telling her that intervening would end, it would undo, it would confirm every decision his body was making right now about what this saddle meant. He went up twice more. Both times, he came down clear of her. Then, he stood breathing hard, the saddle hanging half off his back at an angle that should have looked ridiculous and somehow just looked like proof of what he was. She came off the wall. She walked to him slowly. She straightened the saddle. Her hands were shaking. She didn't let them shake in a way that he could feel, but they were shaking. "Done," she said. He breathed, loud, ragged. "Good," she said. "Me too." She left the saddle on for 20 minutes. He didn't move again. When she unbuckled it and slid it off his back, he turned his head and put his nose directly on her chest, between her collarbones, and stood there. She put both arms around his neck and held on. Nobody saw that part. It was just the two of them in the stall in the July heat, a woman and a horse who had both decided that sometimes the only honest response to surviving something together was to hold on for a minute. She allowed herself a minute. Then she let go and walked out. William was not in the barn corridor this time. He was outside at the fence, and when she came out of the barn, he was already looking at her, and she was still shaking slightly, in a way she couldn't quite stop, and he saw it. "He went up," William said. "3 times. "Are you hurt?" "No." He exhaled. "I heard it from the house. The sound when the saddle hit the wall." He paused. "I nearly came in." "I know," she said. "I'm glad you didn't." "I know you're glad I didn't. That's what stopped me." He was looking at her with that careful intensity she'd gotten used to and still hadn't quite gotten comfortable with. "Your hands are shaking." She looked at them. She'd been trying not to look at them. "Delayed reaction," she said. "It happens." "Come inside," he said. She looked up. "I beg your pardon." "Come inside the house," he said. "Sit down, have something to eat. You've been working for 6 hours straight in July heat, and the horse just scared you badly enough that your hands haven't stopped shaking." She opened her mouth to argue. "Miss Harper," he said, and the way he said it had something in it she wasn't used to hearing from him, something close to please, dressed up in his formal vocabulary because he apparently didn't know another way to say it. "Just come inside." She went inside. The main house was cooler than the barn, genuinely cooler, the thick walls doing what they were built to do. She sat at the kitchen table while the housekeeper, a compact gray-haired woman named Agnes, produced cold water and bread and a plate of meat without comment, with the efficiency of someone who had fed people through worse days than this. William sat across from her. He didn't eat. He watched her eat, which should have been uncomfortable, and wasn't. "Tell me about the saddle," he said. "What he did. What you did." She told him. All of it, the pre-charge signal she'd read, the way she'd moved before he'd committed the 3 attempts, and the recovery, the moment with his nose on her chest. She told it plainly, without drama. Just the sequence of it. And as she talked, she felt the shaking in her hands subside, because talking about it was making it a thing that had already happened, instead of a thing that was still happening inside her body. He listened without interrupting. He was a good listener, she'd noticed that before. He didn't perform attention the way some men did, nodding on a schedule and looking thoughtful on cue. He just listened, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You put your arms around him," he said. She stopped. "You saw that?" "No," he said. "You just told me." She replayed the last few minutes of her telling. She had told him. She hadn't meant to. It had come out the way things come out when you're tired enough that the editing mechanism goes soft. "It was a moment," she said. "It doesn't mean—" "I know what it means," he said. "It means you care about him, not just professionally." He looked at the table, then back at her. "I don't say that as a criticism. I say it because I understand it." He paused. "I tried to ride him the way you tried to ride him just now. Without the weeks of groundwork you've done, without any of the foundation. I just got on." He touched the scar at his jaw. "And when he threw me, I was angry. For months I was angry. At him." He stopped. "And then I was ashamed of being angry at a horse, which was a complicated feeling to be having." She looked at him. "You weren't angry at him," she said. "You were angry at yourself." He looked at her. "For not being able to do what you assumed you should be able to do," she said. The anger at him was just easier to feel. The silence after that was long. Outside, the heat pressed down on the land. Somewhere in the barn, Ruin was standing in his stall with the ghost of a saddle on his back, and 3 weeks of something new between them. "I owe you an apology," William said. She hadn't expected that. "For what?" "For what I said when you arrived, that I expected you to fail." He held her gaze. "I said it because it was true at the time. But it wasn't a kind thing to say, and you deserved better than that as you're beginning here." She was quiet for a moment. "You were honest," she said. "I'd rather honest than kind most days." "Why?" "Because kind runs out," she said. "Honest doesn't." She pushed her chair back and stood. "Thank you for the food." "Evelyn." She stopped. He was still sitting, and he looked up at her, and for a moment, the careful management that he wore like a second coat was entirely absent, and what was there instead was something plain and undefended and entirely real. "What you're doing," he said, "with him. I want you to know that I see it, the full scope of it, not just the breaking the other part, the part that no one else tried." He paused. "And I think it's the most remarkable thing I've seen in a long time." She held his gaze. She did not look away. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She walked out, but she heard him exhale behind her that long, unguarded breath she'd heard before, and this time it sounded less like a man setting something down, and more like a man picking something up. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual. She hadn't slept well since the first night in the tack room, but tonight was different. Not the calculated restlessness of strategy and planning, but something else. Something that had taken up residence below the level of strategy and wasn't interested in being organized. She lay on the cot and listened to the barn breathe around her. And she thought about 23 days. And she thought about hands on a horse's neck. And she thought about a man sitting across a kitchen table looking at her, like she was something he was trying very carefully to understand without breaking. That was the part she was not supposed to be thinking about. She got up at 4 in the morning and sat in the barn corridor in the dark and just existed for a while, which was something she'd learned to do in hard years, just sit in the dark and be a person who was alive and breathing and not currently required to perform competence at anyone. Ruin heard her. She heard him shift in the stall, the slow, deliberate sound of 1,600 pounds adjusting. "I know," she said quietly to the dark. "I know." He stamped once. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." She sat there until gray light came, and then she stood up and got to work. The saddle went on him again on the 24th day, and he stood for it. Not without tension. His skin flinched under it, his tail moved, his ears went through 3 different positions in the first 30 seconds. But he stood. He kept his feet on the ground, and he stood, and she buckled the girth slowly, and talked the whole time low and continuous, and when it was done, she stepped back and looked at him and said, "Good. That was good." He exhaled and dropped his head slightly, which was the hoarse equivalent of saying fine. "I'll allow it. But I want you to know I'm doing you a favor." She laughed. And then she heard clapping. Slow 3 times from the barn corridor. She turned. William was there. Not watching covertly this time, standing openly, his shoulder against the wall, his expression doing something complicated that she didn't have a category for. "Day 24, he said. "Day 24. She agreed. "I owe you an additional apology," he said. "I said you'd fail. You demonstrably haven't." "Saddling a horse isn't riding him," she said. "No," he said. "But it's further than anyone else has gotten." He paused. "Can I come in?" She looked at Ruin, who was looking at William with the same complex expression she was trying to decode. Not hostility, or not pure hostility. Recognition loaded with history. "Slowly," she said. "Stay at the edge. Let him look at you." William came into the stall. Ruin watched him. Every muscle in the horse was aware and awake and tracking. "Talk to him," Evelyn said. William glanced at her. "What? Say something. Anything. He knows your voice. It's in there with everything else. It's part of what he's sorting through. Let him hear it in this context." She paused. "Not a command. Not an order. Just talk." William looked at the horse. He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he wasn't going to do it, that this was too much, too strange outside the vocabulary of a man who conducted every relationship through the clear medium of authority. But then he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said. "Quiet, direct, not theatrical. For what I did 3 years ago when you first came here. I thought I understood what you needed, and I was wrong, and people who were wrong got hurt because of it." He paused. "And you didn't deserve what happened to you. Whatever was done to you before you came here, you didn't deserve it either." Evelyn stood very still. Ruin stood very still. And then the horse. This impossible, furious 3-year project of pain and distrust took 2 steps across the stall and put his nose against William's chest. William went rigid. His hand came up slowly, so slowly she could see the deliberateness of it, the conscious choice, and he placed it against the side of the horse's neck. Neither of them moved. She watched this man stand in the stall with the horse that had scarred him, and she watched something pass between them that she did not have words for. And she thought, this is the real work. Not the saddle, not the rope. This. When William finally stepped back, he looked at her. His eyes were bright. Not crying, not quite. But the brightness was real, and it was close to something, and he didn't try to manage it away, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "How?" he said. Just the one word. "You told him the truth," she said simply. He nodded slowly like he was absorbing something, and then the barn door opened, and Marcus appeared, and with him were 2 men she had never seen before, and the look on Marcus's face cut through the warmth of the moment like a blade through paper. "William," Marcus said, "you need to come out here." "What is it?" Marcus's eyes moved to Evelyn and then back to William. "Hollis is at the gate," he said, "with the county sheriff, and he's got papers." The silence that followed was a different kind entirely from any silence that had existed in that barn before. William's expression closed, just closed like a door shut fast. Everything that had been open and real and unguarded in the last 10 minutes sealed itself behind something harder. "Papers," he said. "Claims on the property line," Marcus said. "He's saying the east pasture, the one bordering his land, belongs to the Hollis acres by right of an old survey. He's got a man from the county office with him and a document with seals on it." Marcus paused. "And he's asking for you specifically. Says if you don't come out in 20 minutes, he'll have the sheriff come in." William looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. In that single exchanged look was everything they hadn't said out loud, and the realization arriving at the same moment for both of them that Preston Hollis hadn't come out to the ranch 2 weeks ago out of friendly interest. He'd come to look at what William had, and now he'd come to take part of it. "Go," she said. William straightened. The careful man came back the controlled, managed armored version of him, and he walked to the stall door and stopped. He looked back at Ruin, and then at her. "Whatever happens out there," he said, "don't stop." She held his gaze. "I won't." He walked out. She listened to his footsteps cross the barn floor and go out the door, and she listened to the voices rising in the yard. William's controlled and deliberate Hollis's carrying that particular swagger of a man who believed he had already won. And she stood in the stall with Ruin and felt the weight of what was happening shift and settle around them like weather. The horse put his nose against her shoulder. She put her hand on his neck. "I know," she said. Outside, the voices grew sharper. And inside in the stall that had been a prison and was becoming something else entirely. A woman and a horse stood together in the July heat and waited to find out what the world was going to ask of them next. The voices in the yard got louder before they got quieter. Evelyn stayed in the stall with Ruin and listened because leaving felt wrong, not because she was afraid, but because Ruin's ears were tracking every sound from outside and his body was reading her body. And if she went tense and moved toward the door, he would go tense too, and 24 days of careful work would pay the price for whatever Preston Hollis was doing in the yard. So she stayed. She breathed. She kept her hand on the horse's neck, and she listened. She could make out William's voice, controlled, deliberate, not raised, and Hollis's voice carrying that particular confidence of a man who had arrived with paperwork and a badge behind him, and considered the conversation essentially finished. The sheriff said something she couldn't parse. Then William again, shorter this time. Then silence. Then boots on gravel moving away. Marcus appeared in this barn doorway 4 minutes later. He looked 10 years older than he had at the start of the morning. "Well," she said. "Hollis has a survey document," Marcus said. He came in slowly and sat on the feed crate by the door like his legs had made a decision his brain hadn't caught up to yet. From 1871, claims the east pasture boundary was misdrawn when William's father bought the land. Says 12 acres that Ashbourne has been running cattle on for 16 years legally belong to the Hollis property. He pressed his hands together. The sheriff said he can't do anything today. There has to be a hearing, a proper review of the documents. But he also said that until the review is complete, William can't sell that land, can't make improvements to it, can't use it as collateral. He paused. "And William has a note coming due in 60 days, secured against the east pasture." She was very still. "How much is the note?" Marcus looked at her. "Enough that losing the pasture as collateral means he can't make the payment." "And if he can't make the payment?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. She stood in the stall with her hand on Ruin's neck and felt the shape of what Hollis had built, not impulsively, not reactively, but carefully over time the way a patient man builds a trap. He'd come to the ranch and looked at the situation, and he'd gone back to town and found the lever. The survey. The note. The timing. "Did William know about the note?" she said. "When he offered me $50? "Yes," Marcus said quietly. "So he hired me knowing that if he couldn't produce the horse, the $50 was the least of his problems." "He hired you," Marcus said, "because the horse was the one thing he had left that might matter. If Ruin could be worked, could be shown to work, it changes the value calculation on the whole property." He looked at the stall. "Ruin is bred from the same line as Ashford's best stock. If he's rideable, if he's functional, if he can be demonstrated to be what he should have been all along, the value of the Ashbourne breeding program goes up substantially, enough to refinance, enough to make Hollis's survey challenge less catastrophic." She was quiet for a long moment. "So the horse was never just a horse," she said. "No," Marcus said. "He never was." She looked at Ruin, who was looking back at her with those dark, complicated eyes, and she thought about William standing in this stall 20 minutes ago saying, "I'm sorry" to an animal that had cost him a scar and 3 years, and apparently more than that. She thought about what it cost a man like William Ashford to say that word and mean it. She thought about honesty and what it asked of people. "Where's William?" she said. "Study," Marcus said. "He asked not to be disturbed." "All right," she said. She unbuckled the saddle girth and slid the saddle off Ruin's back, carefully hung it on the stall rail. "Give him an hour." She gave him 40 minutes. She knocked on the study door, and he said, "Come in," without asking who it was, which told her something about his state of mind. William Ashford was not the kind of man who said, "Come in," without knowing who was on the other side of the door. He was standing at the window, not sitting at the desk, not working, not performing the competent management of a crisis, just standing at the window with his arms at his sides and his back to the room. "You heard," he said. "Marcus told me." "How much did he tell you?" "Enough," she said. "The survey, the note, the 60 days. He turned. He looked tired in a way that was structural rather than physical. Tired in his bones, tired in the part of a person that holds the framework of who they believe themselves to be. "I should have told you," he said, "when I hired you. All of it, not just the horse." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He absorbed that without flinching. "I was afraid you'd leave." "You keep being afraid I'll leave," she said. "You keep giving me reason to be grateful you haven't." She came into the room and sat down in the chair across from his desk because her legs were tired and they'd earned the right to be tired, and because she was done performing easy in a room where no one was watching. "Tell me about the note," she said. "All of it." He sat down behind the desk, and then he told her. It took 20 minutes. The note had been taken out 3 years ago, the same year he'd brought Ruin to the ranch, the same year he'd tried to ride him and failed. He'd been expanding the breeding program, had over-leveraged, had been counting on the East pasture as his security, because it was the most valuable piece of undisputed land he held. The breeding program had underperformed the following year because of a wet summer and a fever that had moved through 2 of his best mares. He'd been managing the gap since then, quietly, the way men managed financial trouble, when they were too proud to name it clearly. "And Ruin," she said. "You said he was supposed to anchor the breeding program." "His bloodline is extraordinary," William said. "On paper, that horse is worth more than everything else on this property combined, if he's functional, if he can be bred, trained, demonstrated." He looked at his hands. 3 years ago, I thought I could handle him myself. That was the original plan. Break him personally, establish him quickly, use him to leverage the program back to profitability. He was quiet. That plan ended in 6 seconds and a fence board. She looked at him. "And you didn't hire anyone else for a year after the others failed because every failed attempt lowered his assessed value," he said. "Word spreads in this county. Every breaker that came out here and left broken or empty-handed made the story worse, made him worth less on paper, even if his bloodline didn't change." He exhaled. "By the time Marcus brought me your name, I was genuinely not sure whether I was hiring you to fix the horse or to try one more time before I accepted that it was unfixable." She thought about that, about arriving at a gate with $11 and a rope and walking into a situation she'd understood less than a quarter of. "You used me," she said. She said it clearly, without heat, the way you state a thing that needs to be stated. "Yes," he said, "partly." "And the other part?" He looked at her directly. "The other part believed you might actually do what no one else had done and wanted to see it happen, because that belief was the last one I had left that hadn't failed me yet." He held her gaze. "I am aware that's a complicated thing to say." "It's an honest thing to say," she said. "I told you I'd rather honest. Even when it reflects poorly on me. Especially then." He was quiet for a moment. "What do we do?" he said. And the "we" in that sentence was not casual. She heard it land with all the weight he'd put behind it, the deliberate choice to include her in the problem instead of presenting it to her as something she was adjacent to. She thought about it. "How much time do I have?" she said. "Realistically, before the hearing, before the note, before any of it becomes irreversible." "The hearing will likely be scheduled in 30 to 40 days, he said. "The note is due at 60, so I have 30 days, she said, "to get Ruin rideable enough that you can demonstrate his value to someone who can make a difference to the refinancing." She paused. "I have 30 days, and he's been saddled once without trying to kill someone, and we haven't even begun to talk about a rider on his back." I know, William said. That's a hard timeline. I know that too. She stood up. All right, she said. Then we'd better not waste the rest of today. She was almost to the door when he said her name. She stopped. Evelyn. He said it differently than he'd said it before, without the careful formality, without the managerial distance. Just her name, plain. Thank you. For not leaving. She stood with her back to him for a moment. Don't thank me yet, she said. We haven't done it. She walked out. But her hands when they hit the doorframe were not shaking. They were steady. And she noticed that, and she held it because steady hands were something you didn't waste. The next 10 days were the hardest of her life. Not because ruin was impossible. He wasn't. Not anymore. Not in the way he'd been impossible at the beginning. The trust was there, built into the architecture of their days, solid enough to hold real work. What was hard was the pace of the work itself, the compression of 30 days into 10, because 30 days wasn't enough, and she knew it, and the knowledge of the note, and the hearing, and the survey, sat behind her eyes every morning when she got up and pushed her through every session, past the point where she'd normally stop. She put a rider's weight on his back on day 27. Not herself, she used a weighted sack lashed to the saddle to give him the experience of distributed weight, without the unpredictability of a human body's movement. He hated it. He expressed this through 4 days of progressive negotiation that involved a great deal of ear-pinning, one spectacular sideways crow hop that sent the weighted sack into the stall wall, and an impressive display of sustained sulking that Marcus said he'd never seen a horse sustain for that long without either exploding or giving up. He didn't explode. He didn't give up. On the 31st day, Evelyn put her foot in the stirrup. She didn't mount. She put her foot in and put weight on it, and held it there standing in the stirrup with her hands on the saddle, and waited for ruin to decide what this meant. He went rigid. Completely rigid, every muscle, his breath stopped. She held the position and talked low and continuous, and counted seconds in her head, and at the count of 42, his breath came back. She stepped down. She came back an hour later and did it again, and again. On the 33rd day, she swung her leg over and sat in the saddle. He stood for exactly 6 seconds. Then he went sideways, both feet off the ground on the left side, a motion that was less explosion than it was violent surprise, and she went with it, not fighting it, not gripping, just following the movement, the way she'd learned to follow his breathing, the way you follow anything you're trying not to break. She stayed in the saddle, not gracefully, not easily. She stayed by will and instinct, and 33 days of learning his body's language, and when he came back to all 4 feet, she was still there. He stood very still. She sat very still. All right, she said, breathing hard. All right. He took 1 step forward, then another. She kept her hands soft on the reins, barely a suggestion, barely contact, and he walked 3 steps and stopped. She didn't push. She sat for 1 full minute, and then she dismounted. Her knees nearly went when she hit the ground. She grabbed the saddle and held herself up and breathed for a moment, and then she straightened and looked at Ruin, who turned his head and looked at her. "You just let me ride you," she said. Her voice came out strange, too full, too close to something she wasn't ready to name. "You know that, right? You just decided to let me ride you." He looked at her with those dark, complicated eyes. She put her forehead against the side of his neck and stood there. Behind her in the barn corridor, she heard a sharp intake of breath that she recognized as Marcus, and another sound underneath it, quieter, controlled, a sound a man makes when something he'd stopped believing in arrives anyway. She kept her forehead on Ruin's neck for another few seconds. Then she stepped back and turned around. William was standing at the stall entrance. Marcus was beside him. Both of them had come in quietly sometime in the last minute, and both of them looked like men who had witnessed something that had rearranged something important inside them. William looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. He looked like a man holding himself very carefully together around an experience that was testing the seams of his composure. 3 steps, she said. 3 steps, he repeated. It'll be more tomorrow. She ran a hand over her face. And less the day after that, probably. And then more again. That's how this goes. I know, he said. I watched you. I know how this goes now. He paused. I owe you more than $50. She looked at him steadily. Let's get through the hearing first. Right, he said. The hearing. He said it like a man remembering a war he'd temporarily forgotten he was in. The hearing was set for 38 days out from Hollis's arrival. William's lawyer, a dry, precise man named Calloway, who arrived from the county seat in a coat that was too warm for July, and looked at everything on the property with the expression of a man performing a very thorough appraisal, spent 3 days at Ashbourne, going over every document in William's possession. He came to Evelyn on the second day. I need to understand the horse's current status, he said. He had a notebook. He looked at Ruin in the stall with the expression of someone who had been told to assess something he had no framework for assessing. He's being ridden, she said. Saddle work, short sessions building. Ridden. Calloway repeated, writing something. As in controllable. As in progressing toward controllable, she said. There's a difference. He looked up from his notebook. The difference matters in a courtroom, Miss Harper. The difference matters everywhere, she said. But yes, I understand the stakes. He studied her for a moment. How long before you'd call him demonstrably writable in front of witnesses? She thought about it honestly. 3 weeks, she said. If nothing goes wrong. We have 5 weeks until the hearing. Then we have 2 weeks of buffer, she said. Which sounds like a lot until you've spent time with this horse. Calloway wrote something else. Mr. Ashford speaks highly of your work. That's kind of him. He was considerably less kind about it, Calloway said mildly. He was specific. There's a difference. He closed his notebook. The survey document Hollis has presented is old. 16-year-old surveys have been successfully challenged before on the grounds of measuring error and post-document land changes. The legal case is not lost. He paused. But having the horse functional demonstrably witnesses present functional removes Hollis's most powerful argument, which is that Ashbourne's assets are overstated. A non-functional horse claimed as the cornerstone of a breeding program is a liability. A functional one changes the entire valuation. He looked at Ruin. So 3 weeks. 3 weeks, she said. He left. She turned back to Ruin, who had been watching Calloway with the focused suspicion he reserved for strangers. You heard the man, she said. 3 weeks. Ruin pinned his ears. I know, she said. Me too. She rode him the next day for 10 minutes. He went sideways twice and forward the rest of the time, and by the end of the 10 minutes, she could feel something she hadn't felt in 35 days of this work, the beginning of rhythm. The starting shape of a horse and rider who were learning together what it meant to move as one thing instead of two. She came out of the session, and William was at the fence, and she was grinning again, that wide, private, slightly ridiculous grin, and she didn't try to manage it because she was too tired and too genuinely happy to bother. Well, William said. 10 minutes, she said. He went sideways twice. The rest was William. The rest was... She stopped. She didn't have the right word. You'll have to come see it yourself tomorrow. I'll be there, he said. He was there. Every session after that, he was there, not close, not interfering. Standing at the fence or the stall entrance, watching with that careful, absorbing attention that had stopped feeling like scrutiny and started feeling like something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. On the 42nd day, she rode Ruin across the paddock at a walk for 25 minutes, and he didn't go sideways at all, and his ears were forward, and the rhythm between them was real and present and unmistakable. William watched from the fence without moving. When she dismounted, he walked to her across the paddock, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and she didn't either, and then he said, "He's magnificent." "He always was," she said. "We just didn't know how to look at him yet." He looked at her. The July heat was sitting on everything on the fence rails, and the dry grass, and both of them, and in the heat, his expression was entirely unmanaged. Everything she'd been watching through the careful surface of this man for 6 weeks was just present, right there. I'm not only talking about the horse, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away first because she was not sure she was ready to stand in that particular truth while also managing to breathe correctly. "The wall," she said. He blinked. "Beg your pardon. The stone wall at the north end of the property." She kept her eyes on Ruin. "I've seen you look at it. Marcus told me that's where you were riding when Ruin threw you, where you hit the fence." She paused. "That wall is what Calloway needs. Not just Ruin being ridden in a paddock. Ruin jumping that wall in front of witnesses would be proof that can't be questioned. Proof that he's not just functional, that he's exceptional." The silence after that was significant. "He threw me at that wall," William said. "That was the jump he refused. That was the last thing before—" "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." "Evelyn." His voice carried something careful in it. "That wall is 5 feet of solid stone. If he refuses again, if he goes sideways at speed with you in the saddle—" "I know what happens if he refuses at speed," she said. "I've thought about it." And she looked at him. "And I think he's not the same horse he was 2 years ago. And I think I'm not the same rider those other 11 people were." She paused. "And I think some things have to be jumped because the only other option is living on the wrong side of them forever." He looked at her for a long moment. She thought he was going to argue. She was ready for the argument. Had the responses organized, the logic stacked, the case prepared. She'd been making cases to men who underestimated her since she was 16 years old, and she was very good at it by now. He didn't argue. "When?" he said. 2 weeks before the hearing," she said. "We need time to build up to it. Start with smaller jumps. There's a brush fence in the south pasture and the log rail by the creek. Build the confidence on both sides, his and mine. Then the wall." He nodded, slowly. "All right. All right." She hadn't expected it to be that simple. "You've been right about everything else," he said. "About the door, about the rope, about the saddle, about what to say to him and when to say nothing." He met her eyes. "I'd be a fool to stop listening now." She turned away before the thing on her face could be read too clearly. She was at the barn entrance when he said, "Evelyn." She stopped. This was becoming a pattern, him calling her back from doorways, and her stopping, and both of them standing in the space between what was said and what wasn't. She was both exasperated by it and aware in a way she didn't examine closely that she always stopped. "The thing you said," he said, "about living on the wrong side of things forever." He paused. "Were you only talking about the horse?" She kept her back to him for a moment. "I'm going to go check on the south pasture fence," she said. She walked out. She heard him exhale behind her, and this time it wasn't a sound of relief or of something being set down. It was something else. Something that sounded very much like a man who had just decided something. She didn't ask what he decided. She didn't need to. She already knew. The brush fence came first. She brought Ruin to it on the 45th day, walking just to see, just to let him look at it and make whatever calculation he was going to make. He stopped in front of it and put his nose down and breathed in the smell of cut wood and dry grass. His ears went forward and stayed there. She turned him away, came back at a trot. He cleared it like it was nothing, like it had never been a question. She brought him around and did it again, and then a third time, and by the third time his stride going into it had that particular gathering quality, that collection of energy that a horse does when it has decided that the thing in front of it is not a threat, but a challenge. And it has decided to meet the challenge. She came out of the south pasture, and William was waiting at the gate on his own horse, a calm bay that he rode with the ease of a man who had grown up in a saddle, and for a moment she just looked at him there, this man on his horse in the afternoon light, and she let herself feel the full, uncomplicated truth that she had been carefully managing around for 6 weeks. She was in serious trouble. Not the horse, not the hearing, not Hollis. This man right here looking at her with that expression she'd stopped being able to pretend was merely professional interest. This was the trouble. "Well," he said. "3 times. She said. "Clean. He's ready for the log rail." William looked at her for a moment. "You're grinning again," he said. "I know," she said. It keeps happening. I find I don't mind it, he said. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Ashford. William, he said. I think we're past Mr. Ashford. She held his gaze. William. She tried it out. It fit differently than she'd expected. We have 2 weeks and a stone wall. We do, he said. Can we focus on that first? Can you? He said. She turned Ruin toward the barn before he could see her face. Behind her she heard him follow, and the sound of both horses' hooves on the dry summer ground was steady and even, and somehow exactly right. And she thought 33 days ago this horse had never been ridden. 45 days ago I walked through a gate with $11 and a rope. And now here they were, 2 weeks from a stone wall that William Ashford had never cleared. 2 weeks from a courtroom hearing that would decide whether everything he'd built would survive. 2 weeks from whatever it was that was building between them like a summer storm, slow and inevitable, and not quite arrived yet. She rode back to the barn in the heat of the afternoon and thought about walls, about what it cost to stand in front of one and choose to go forward, about the fact that some jumps once you'd committed to them could not be uncommitted. The approach was the thing. Once you'd aimed yourself at the wall and asked the horse beneath you to believe in the same impossible thing you were asking of yourself, there was no graceful way back. Only through. She put Ruin away and rubbed him down and checked his legs and talked to him quietly while she worked, and he stood with his head low and his eyes soft, and the whole of his enormous body at ease in a way that she still found slightly miraculous in a quiet and private place she'd stopped arguing with. When she finally came out of the stall and latched the door, the barn was dim and the heat outside was beginning to break the first suggestion of evening coming in through the gaps in the boards, and William was sitting on the feed crate where Marcus usually sat, his elbows on his knees watching her. I've been thinking about what you said, he said, about some things having to be jumped because the alternative is living on the wrong side forever. She leaned against the stall door. And I've been on the wrong side of several things, he said, for a long time, some of them by circumstance, some by my own doing. He looked at her. I find I don't want to be on the wrong side of everything. She was quiet. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I'm not asking for a response. He stopped. I wanted you to know that, before the wall, before the hearing, before any of it. He met her eyes. Whatever happens in the next 2 weeks, I wanted that said. She stood in the quiet of the barn with the sound of Ruin breathing softly behind the stall door, and the evening coming in, and this man sitting on a feed crate looking at her like she was something he was not afraid to want. She said, "Get some sleep, William." But she said it softly. And she walked to the tack room, and she lay down on the narrow cot, and she stared at the ceiling, and she did not sleep for a very long time. Because she was thinking about walls, and about what it meant to finally decide to jump. She was up before dawn on the day of the wall, not because she'd set herself to wake. She hadn't slept enough for waking to mean anything. She'd been lying on the cot in the tack room since midnight, listening to the barn breathe, running the approach in her head, the way she'd been running it for 2 weeks. The angle of entry, the distance, the speed she'd need enough to carry them over, not so much that a refusal would send them both sideways into 5 feet of solid stone at a pace that left no room for surviving it. She knew the numbers. She'd walked the approach 12 times in the last week with William beside her. 3 of those times, both of them pacing out the ground without speaking much, because the math was serious enough that talking around it felt wrong. The log rail had gone clean. Every time, both of them, something clicking into place between horse and rider that she could feel but not quite name, the way Ruin gathered himself 3 strides out, the way his ears went forward and stayed there, the way he stopped calculating whether she was worth trusting and simply trusted. She'd felt it happen, that shift, and she'd carried the feeling of it carefully through the days since, like something she was afraid to look at too directly, in case looking made it fragile. Today was the wall. She got up, pulled on her boots, and went to Ruin first. Before anything else, before coffee, before she let her mind run ahead to the hearing or the witnesses Calloway had arranged. Or the look on Preston Hollis's face when she'd seen him in town 3 days ago. A look that said he'd heard about the riding, had calculated its implications, and had decided it wasn't enough. Before all of that, she went to the horse. He heard her coming. He always heard her coming now, not with the charged, dangerous attention of the early days, but with something quieter. Something that had the shape of welcome, without being so simple as that. She unlatched the stall and went in and stood with him in the dark, her hand on his neck, and didn't say anything for a long time. He put his nose against her shoulder, and she let him, and they stood together in the pre-dawn quiet, and she breathed, and he breathed, and she thought, whatever happens today, this happened. 50 days ago, this horse had decided every human being on earth was his enemy. And now, here we are standing in the dark like old friends. That was already something. That was already if everything else went wrong enough. She heard the barn door, and she knew without turning who it was. William came in quietly, which he'd gotten good at over 50 days of learning the rhythms of the barn. He stopped at the stall entrance. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I." He was quiet for a moment. In the dark, she could make out the shape of him leaning against the stall frame. Not tense. Not performing calm, just there. She'd learned to tell the difference on him, the way she'd learned to tell the difference on Ruin. The real version of a person and the managed version looked similar from a distance, and nothing alike up close. "How is he?" William said. "Good," she said. "Steady." She kept her hand on Ruin's neck. "He's ready." "And you?" She thought about giving the easy answer. "I'm ready," she said, which was true. And then, "I'm also afraid," which was also true. He didn't say anything immediately, and she appreciated that the fact that he'd stopped trying to manage her emotions or fix them or reassure them away. He just let her say it. "When I tried to ride him," William said, "at the wall, I wasn't afraid going in. I was certain. I thought certainty was the same thing as readiness." He paused. "It's not." "No," she said. "Fear means you understand what's actually at stake," he said. "That's what you told me, about the horses." She had told him that. 6 weeks ago, standing at a water trough. She hadn't expected him to remember it exactly. "Yeah," she said. "That's what I told you." He stepped into the stall and came to stand beside her. Not close enough to crowd the horse, he'd learned that too. Close enough that she was aware of him the way you're aware of warmth in a cold room. "Whatever happens today," he said, "I want you to know." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't do the before the battle speech," she said. "We'll get through the wall, and then you can say whatever you were going to say." She paused. "I'd rather hear it on the other side." He was quiet. Then, "All right." She felt him smile in the dark. Not saw felt. There was a difference. "Let's go get Calloway's witnesses fed and ready," she said. Calloway had arranged 5 witnesses for the morning. 3 were men from the county, a land assessor, a livestock evaluator, and a banker named Prescott, who held 2 of William's accounts, and whose opinion on the value of the Ashbourne breeding program carried weight that Calloway had described as significant, and that Evelyn had translated as if this man is impressed, the refinancing becomes possible. The other 2 were local ranchers' men who knew horses, who knew the county, and whose word in a hearing room would mean something to a judge who also knew horses and the county. They arrived at 8 in the morning, 5 men on horseback coming up the Ashbourne Drive in a group, and Evelyn watched them come from the paddock fence, with Ruin saddled beside her, and felt the particular quality of the moment settle around her like a second skin. This was it. Calloway greeted them at the main house. William stood with him, dressed in his good coat, looking like the man he'd been performing at the beginning of her time here, composed authoritative, the proprietor of Ashbourne Range presenting his property for assessment. She'd seen through that version of him for weeks now. But she understood it this morning. Some performances were strategic. Preston Hollis was not among the witnesses. She hadn't expected him to be. But she'd heard from Marcus that he'd been told that Calloway had made sure the right people knew what was being demonstrated today and when. Hollis would know by this afternoon. The thought of that gave her a quiet satisfaction she decided not to feel too guilty about. She brought Ruin into the paddock first. Just the paddock. Just a demonstration of basic work-walk-trot, the responsiveness to her hands and her seat. The simple proof that what they had was real and functional and not a story. The 5 witnesses stood at the fence and watched, and she was aware of their watching. The way you're aware of weather present significant, but not something you could do anything about. She focused on the horse. She focused on the connection between her hands and his mouth, her seat, and his back, the language they'd been building for 50 days. He was brilliant. She used that word in her head without irony or inflation because it was simply the accurate word. He moved under her with the quality of something that had been built for exactly this. The power in his hindquarters, the length of his stride, the way he came round, and soft under her hands, without fighting, without resistance, with the particular ease of an animal that was no longer at war with itself. She heard one of the ranchers say something to the man beside him. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. She brought him back to the walk and stopped in front of the fence. Prescott, the banker, spoke first. "That's Ruin," he said. "The Ruin." "Yes, sir," she said. He looked at William. "I've heard the stories." "Most of them are true," William said. Prescott looked at the horse for a long moment. "And the rest? The rest is what you're looking at now," William said. She turned Ruin toward the gate of the paddock. "Gentlemen," she said, "if you'd like to follow us to the north field, there's one more thing." The walk to the wall took 8 minutes. 8 minutes of the 5 witnesses trailing behind her and William on horseback. Calloway on foot. Marcus beside him, with the expression of a man who had been praying quietly and persistently for the last 2 weeks and wasn't sure if it had done any good. The morning was already warm July, doing what it always did, and the light was clean and flat and very clear. The kind of clarity that made everything look either beautiful or exposed depending on what you were carrying. She was carrying a lot. The wall came into view as they crested the low rise of the north field, and she heard one of the ranchers make a quiet sound. It was as it had always been an imposing thing, 5 feet of stacked stone solid and absolute sitting across the field like a statement. This was not a fence. This was not a brush jump or a log rail. This was the kind of obstacle that asked a serious question about the animal and the rider both, and the question it asked was not polite. She stopped 50 yards out and let Ruin look at it. He looked. His ears went forward, both of them straight-locked. She felt his body change under her, that gathering, that collection, the particular quality of a horse that has recognized a challenge and is deciding what to do about it. William pulled up beside her. "How are you feeling?" he said quietly, not for the witnesses, for her. "Ask me in 5 minutes," she said. He looked at the wall. She looked at the wall. And then he said very quietly something she hadn't expected. "He refused me here," William said. "Right here approximately. I felt him refuse 3 strides out, and I pushed anyway, and he went sideways, and I went over the fence instead of the wall, and I lay in the dirt, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought some things really can't be fixed. That was what I thought lying in the dirt." She looked at him. "And then I got up," he said, "and went back to the house, and I spent 3 years being angry about it." He met her eyes. "I was wrong about the thing I thought in the dirt. I want you to know that before you ride." She held his gaze for a moment. "Some things can't be fixed," she said. "But some things were never broken. They just needed someone to stop treating them like they were." He looked at her with that unmanaged expression, the real one, the one she'd stopped pretending she didn't know the shape of. "Go," he said softly. "Take him over." She turned back to the wall. She gave Ruin a moment, just one, to finish his looking. Then she turned him in a wide arc, giving him room to find the approach to organize himself to make the decision that had to be his as much as hers. She aimed him at the wall. He felt it in her seat, before she'd done anything overt with her hands. The intention, the commitment. The thing that happens when a rider stops calculating and starts trusting. His stride lengthened. 1 step. 2, 3. He was not afraid. She could feel that. 50 days of learning his body's language, and she could feel it as clearly as she could feel her own heartbeat. This horse, this impossible horse that had decided human beings were his enemy and defended that decision for 3 years, was not afraid. He was engaged. He was present. He was in the particular vocabulary of an animal that had finally been given a reason to working with her. 6 strides out. 5. She felt his hindquarters drop and engaged the power coming up through his back through the saddle into her. Not violence, not explosion, but gathered force. Everything he was organized toward a single point. 4 strides. 3. She heard William behind her say something. 1 word. She didn't catch it. It didn't matter. 2 strides. She felt him leave the ground. And then nothing. No ground, no wall, just air and the enormous suspension of 1,600 pounds of horse and 130 pounds of woman hanging for a full second in the July morning above 5 feet of stone that had for 2 years been the symbol of everything that couldn't be fixed, couldn't be bridged, couldn't be gotten over. They cleared it. She felt the wall pass beneath them, didn't see it. Felt it, and then the descent and the landing and the impact traveling up through the saddle into her spine in a single clean shock, and Ruin's hooves on the far side of the wall, and the sound of it. She brought him to a halt 6 strides out. She sat in the saddle and breathed. Her whole body was shaking. Not fear, she recognized the difference, now understood it in her bones. Not fear. Something else. Something that didn't have a smaller word than everything. She turned him around. On the other side of the wall, 5 men stood without speaking. Marcus had his hat off. Calloway was writing in his notebook, but his hand had stopped. Prescott the banker was looking at Ruin the way a man looks at something that has just revised his understanding of what is possible. William had not moved. He was still on his horse exactly where she'd left him, and he was looking at her with a look that was going to live in her memory for the rest of her life. It was not triumph. It was not vindication, though it was something related to those things. It was the look of a man who had believed in the dirt that some things couldn't be fixed and was looking at the proof of how wrong he'd been and was not ashamed of being wrong. Was grateful for it. Was something close to undone by it. She rode Ruin back around the wall at a walk. When she came through the gate, Marcus stepped forward first and put his hand on the horse's neck and said, "Good boy," in a voice that cracked slightly on the second word, and she decided she was not going to make anything of that because she was also not entirely in control of her own voice right now. Prescott spoke next. He looked at William. "That animal," he said, "is worth considerably more than your current loan. We should talk." He looked at Evelyn. "Miss Harper, I've been evaluating horse properties in this county for 20 years. That was the finest piece of horsemanship I've seen in that time." She met his eyes. "Thank you, sir." The ranchers were talking to each other to Calloway, the assessor making notations. The conversation around her picking up the momentum of men who had seen something worth discussing. She let it happen around her. She was still in the process of landing. William dismounted. He walked to her. She was still in the saddle, and he stopped beside Ruin's shoulder and looked up at her. And in the clear July morning, with 5 witnesses and a jumped wall behind them, he looked like the most unguarded she'd ever seen him. "I'd like to say the thing I was going to say this morning," he said. "We're on the other side of the wall," she said. "We are," he said. She waited. "I've been on this property for 16 years," he said. "I've bred horses here, built something here, buried people I cared about here. I've had good years and bad ones, and one terrible one that left a mark." He touched the scar at his jaw, the same unconscious gesture there, and gone. "And I thought I knew what this place was to me, what I was to it." He paused. "And then you walked through my gate with a rope and $11, and you looked at a horse that everyone had given up on, and you saw what was underneath the problem." He held her gaze. "And somewhere in the last 50 days I realized you were looking at everything here the same way, including me." She was quiet. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not Hollis. I'm not a man who thinks that what happened here entitles me to something." He exhaled. "I just needed you to know that what I feel is real, not gratitude, not the romanticized relief of a man whose problem got solved." He looked at her steadily. "Real." She looked at him for a long moment. At this careful, complicated, deeply stubborn man who had spent 6 weeks being systematically disassembled by a woman with a rope and a theory, and who had let it happen, and who was standing in front of her now without a single piece of armor in place. She swung down from the saddle. She landed in front of him, closer than she'd intended, or maybe exactly as close as she'd intended, and she looked up at him and said, "William." "Yes," he said. "The hearing is in 3 days." "I know." "And Hollis is going to fight it." "He is." "And there's still the survey and the note and Calloway's argument, and about 14 things that could go wrong between now and a judge's decision." "I know all of that," he said. She looked at him. "So let's get through 3 more days," she said. "And then we'll talk about real." He looked at her. And then for the first time since she'd met him, William Ashford smiled. Not the careful, managed expression she'd seen occasionally, not the controlled, almost laugh she'd catalogued in the early weeks. A real smile, full and unguarded and slightly helpless. The smile of a man who had just been told something that amounted to yes, wrapped in the most practical language she could find for it. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she said. She took Ruin's reins and walked him back toward the barn, and she was aware of William falling into step beside her, not too close and not too far, and the 5 witnesses ahead of them, discussing numbers and value and the hearing, with the focused energy of men who had seen something that changed their calculations, and Marcus walking with his hat in his hand and his face full of something too big for his usual expressions to hold. She was aware of all of it. And she was aware of the wall behind them, cleared and solid and permanent, exactly what it had always been. They were just on the other side of it now. The hearing was 3 days later on a Thursday in the county courthouse. Evelyn did not attend. Calloway had advised that her presence would give Hollis an angle, would let him make the proceedings about the nature of her arrangement at Ashbourne, about the gossip he'd been feeding carefully through town for weeks, about anything other than the survey and the note, and the demonstrated value of the breeding program. She'd agreed because Calloway was right, and because the hearing was William's to fight, and she'd already done her part. She stayed at the ranch with Marcus, and worked Ruin in the paddock, and tried not to think about courtrooms. She managed this with limited success. Marcus was quiet most of the morning, which was unusual. He worked beside her without saying much, fixing the south pasture gate, checking the fence line, the ordinary labor of a ranch day. Around noon he came and stood at the paddock fence and watched her ride for a while, and she felt his watching and let it be. "He's going to win," Marcus said finally. She brought Ruin to a walk. "You don't know that." "No," Marcus said. "But I know Calloway's got 5 witnesses and a jumped wall and a banker ready to refinance. And I know Hollis's survey is from 1871, and the man who drew it is dead, and his instruments were bad by current standards." He leaned on the fence. "And I know that Judge has lived in this county his whole life and has seen what Hollis does to his neighbors and has an opinion about it that he can't usually act on." He looked at her. "Sometimes things work out." She walked Ruin another circuit. "Sometimes they do," she said. "And sometimes," Marcus said to no one in particular, "a woman walks through a gate with a rope and makes an impossible thing happen, and the rest of the impossible things start to seem a little more possible." She stopped in front of him. He looked at her with his worn, genuine, cracked leather face and said, "I'm glad Doyle knew your name." She felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she wasn't expecting. "So am I," she said. She was rubbing Ruin down in the barn when she heard the horse coming up the drive. Fast, not emergency fast, but purposeful fast, the pace of a man with news and a reason to deliver it. She came out of the stall. William came through the barn door. She looked at his face. He looked at her. "We won," he said. The breath that left her body had been waiting since the day Hollis rode up with the sheriff, and the papers may be longer, Maybe, since she'd walked through the gate, some accumulation of held tension that released all at once, like a rope cut clean. "The survey," she said. "Thrown out," he said. Measuring error of the era compounded by a property boundary adjustment in 1879 that superseded the original survey entirely. Calloway had the 1879 document. Hollis's lawyer didn't. He walked toward her. "Prescott has agreed to terms on the refinancing. 12-year note favorable rate with Ruin's assessed value as primary collateral." He stopped in front of her. "Calloway says the assessed value as of this morning is 4 times what it was 3 months ago." She looked at him. 4 times. "The witnesses from the wall," he said. "Word travels fast in this county." She thought about that. About how fast bad news traveled in this county. The gossip about her presence here, the stories Hollis had been cultivating, the talk Marcus had brought back from town. Word traveled fast when it was designed to damage. Apparently, it traveled just as fast when it wasn't. "Hollis," she said. "Left the courthouse before the ruling was finished," William said. His lawyer stayed for the formal decision. He didn't. A pause. "He'll find another angle. He's that kind of man, but not this one, not today." She nodded. They stood in the barn in the afternoon quiet, and Ruin made a soft sound in his stall, and somewhere outside a hawk called once sharp and clear, and then silence. 3 days, William said. She looked up at him. "You said give you 3 days, he said. "It's been 3 days. She had said that. Standing in the north field with a jumped wall behind them, she had said 3 days and let it mean what it meant. "So it has," she said. He looked at her. That unguarded, real, unmanaged look that she'd stopped having any defense against. "I'd like to take a ride with you," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Nothing formal. Just the north field. You on Ruin, me on my horse, the 2 of us." He paused. "And then I'd like to have whatever conversation we keep stopping before it starts." She held his gaze. "What time tomorrow?" she said. He exhaled. "Early," he said. "Before the heat." "I'll be up," she said. She always was. He left the barn, and she went back to Ruin and finished rubbing him down, and she talked to him while she worked low and comfortable the easy conversation of 2 beings who had gotten past the hard part and were learning what the other side of it felt like. "Well," she said, "we did it." He leaned into the brushstroke. "Don't get smug about it," she said. He didn't. He just stood with his eyes half closed and his enormous body at ease, and she worked the brush along his shoulder and thought about the morning she'd arrived, the $11, the rope, the gate hand's skeptical look. 57 days ago. It felt like a different life, and the same one both at once, the way significant time always feels when you're standing at the end of it looking back. She thought about her father, who had taught her that a horse didn't owe you trust, and you earned it or you didn't. She thought about what he'd say seeing this horse, seeing this barn, seeing the evidence of what 57 days of believing in a thing could produce. She thought he'd probably say, "Took you long enough." She smiled. She finished with Ruin and gave him his evening feed and latched the stall and stood for a moment in the barn corridor in the last of the afternoon light, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not just the hearing, not just the wall, not just the horse, all of it. Every door she'd unlatched. Every morning she'd gotten up before dawn and chosen to go back in. Every moment she'd held her ground when everything in her said move. Every moment she'd moved when everything around her said stay. She'd come here with nothing but a rope and a theory. She was leaving with something she didn't have a complete word for yet. But she knew its shape. She'd learned its shape over 57 days, the same way she'd learned Ruin's slowly, carefully, without rushing what couldn't be rushed. And like Ruin, like everything in this barn that had been worth anything, it was not a thing that had been given. It had been earned. Every single inch of it. The next morning she was up before dawn, same as always, pulling on her boots in the gray dark of the tack room. Ruin heard her and shifted in his stall, and she said quietly, "I know." And he was still. She stepped out into the corridor, and William was already there, same as the morning of the wall. standing in the pre-dawn dark, waiting 2 tin mugs of coffee in his hands. She looked at the mugs. She looked at him. "You," she said, "are going to have to stop doing that. It keeps catching me off guard." "Good," he said. He held one out. She took it. They stood in the barn and drank their coffee and didn't say anything for a while, and the ranch woke up slowly around them, the horses in the near stalls beginning to move, the first birds starting somewhere outside the particular quality of the world in the few minutes before full light when anything still feels possible. "Ready," he said. She looked at him. At this man who had cost her sleep and given her a reason to get up and turned out in the end to be exactly as worth the trouble as she'd suspected and refused to admit. "I've been ready," she said. She went and got Ruin. They rode out into the morning together, a woman who had arrived with nothing and built something real, a man who had believed in the dirt that some things couldn't be fixed, and a horse that had decided one careful day at a time to trust the world again. The wall stood behind them, cleared and permanent. And ahead of them, the land opened wide and certain the way it does after the hardest things are finally irrevocably done.